Thank you very much. My name is Mary-Ann Stephenson. I am the director of the Women's Budget Group. We've moved down off the stage because it was a little bit unsteady and we thought it was better to be down here because we didn't want to start the morning with a drama. So I'm really delighted to be here at this conference. It's really, really great to see you all. And we've got a fabulous panel for you this morning. As Sue said, you know, feminist economists have had a long history of challenging the kind of norms and underlying assumptions of conventional economics, and in particular highlighting the significance of care. And that's something that's been central to the Women's Budget Group's work since the beginning. But also more recently, we've been drawing on work of feminist and environmental economists looking at the importance of actually having an economy that's sustainable for the planet's future through our feminist Green New Deal work. Now, a few years ago, we started a project specifically looking at examining feminist approaches to macroeconomic policy, but also to explain what the term macroeconomic means to a lot of feminist organisations and women's organisations, because often these terms can be quite excluding. People can think, well, I can't take part in that discussion because I don't know what you're talking about. What we're talking about here is policy that's about the economy as a whole. And this work was really brilliantly led for us by Professor Diane Elson, who is here with us today, who is a former chair of the Women's Budget Group, also a chair of the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, among many other things. And she chaired a series of roundtable groups and also some workshops for members of the Early Career Network. So some of you may have been able to take part in that. And so it's really great that we've got her with us today. We're also really lucky to have Ozlem Onaran, who's Professor of Workforce and Economic Development Policy at the University of Greenwich. Ozlem's done work for us particularly to contribute, I'm all over the place, to our feminist Green New Deal work around a shorter working week, which has actually influenced what's happening at the moment internally at the Women's Budget Group, which was we are trialling a shorter working week for Women's Budget Group staff. So anybody on the staff team who wants to say thanks to Ozlem? There she is. So it's really great to have her here today. And finally, but not least, it's absolutely wonderful to have Yuan Yang, who was is a co-founder of the campaign Rethinking Economics. She's been the Financial Times Europe and China correspondent, Deputy Beijing Bureau Chief for the Financial Times, also worked for The Economist. And it's brilliant to have her here today because she is a real expert in thinking about how you make an economics curriculum that's relevant, how you communicate economic ideas to a wider population. So it's not just this kind of up in an ivory tower, nobody else can take part in those discussions. And so what we're going to do, we've asked each member of the panel to address a particular question. So they're going to do that in turn, speaking for about sort of 15 minutes or so, and then we will have time for questions at the end. We will cut into the break a little bit, but I'm going to try and keep us as much to time as possible because I think one of the great things about these conferences is the breaks and the opportunities to talk to each other, so we don't want to lose that. So I'm going to start off with Diane Elson, and we asked you, Diane, to look at how austerity policies that adversely impact on women and marginalised groups can be avoided. So over to you. Thank you.
Is it switched on? Thank you. I'm going to stand over here because I cannot speak for 15 minutes without some notes. And there's no table there for me to put my notes on. It's very uncomfortable sitting with them, sort of perching them on your knee. So let me say I'm delighted to be here to meet old friends, to make new friends for this first big in-person event. Since we had to stop doing these kind of things during COVID. So I'm really looking forward to this, both to the discussions in our sessions and in the tea break and the lunch as well. So hold this a minute while I do take out my notes. Thank you. So as Marianne said, I was asked to speak about how can austerity policies that adversely impact women and marginalized groups be avoided? I mean, a question that Rachel Reeves should definitely be considering, I think. So first, what's meant by austerity policies? Cuts to public expenditure, supposedly to reduce the budget deficit and the debt to GDP ratio. But the first thing to note is actually expenditure cuts don't tend to have this effect because they lower aggregate demand in the economy, and that dampens economic growth, dampens tax revenues, and means you don't actually reduce the budget deficit or the debt to GDP ratio. So it's a somewhat self-defeating policy. And of course, although we may be told that the reason for this is to reduce the budget deficit and the debt to GDP ratio, the underlying reasons also include a strong desire to make the public sector smaller, at least to change the nature of the public sector. Let me turn to the impact of austerity policies. That's something on which the Women's Budget Group has done a lot of work, and many of you would be familiar with that. The kind of expenditure cuts that the UK government has implemented since 2010 have reduced incomes via cuts to social security benefits, so we barely have anything that would be called a welfare state anymore, and reduced access to public services, health, education, care, and other local government services. And the Women's Budget Group has shown how these adverse impacts of these cuts were proportionately much greater for women than for men, worse for single mothers than other types of household, and worse for ethnic minority women. If you haven't already read it, let me commend to you the report on intersecting inequalities that the Women's Budget Group did with the Runnymede Trust. That's Zubaida here, who's currently the deputy director of the Women's Budget Group, was very involved with. And I think that showed also you can look at these issues if you can get the data in an intersectional way. And of course, we found out who was the worst affected in proportion to their incomes, to their access to public services. It was ethnic minority single mothers. But do read that report. Now, avoiding adverse impacts. I'm going to speak about three things. The first is reform public spending. The second is reform taxation and raise tax revenues. And the third is increase government borrowing. So first, reform public spending. I expect to hear a lot about reforming public spending from the Labour front bench and from a Labour government. I think Wes Streeting is already talking a lot about that. We have to unpack what's meant, though, by reforming public spending. In the period since 2010, reform has been understood and implemented in ways that have adverse impacts for women and for marginalized groups, such as tightening conditions for social security benefits, penalizing people who inadvertently break the rules, such as the recently revealed scandal of the pursuit of people in receipt of the carer's allowance, reducing the time that can be spent on each visit in domiciliary care has been regarded as a reform in public spending, and keeping down public sector pay. These are not the kind of reforms that we want to see. However, there are more progressive ways of thinking about reforming public spending. So reforms to combat the extract of profit from public spending. We have quite a high level of public spending, but a lot of that immediately goes into the pockets of private companies. So one is to recover the money that was lost during COVID on fraudulent PPP contracts and fraudulent claims for business support. A second is to scrutinize all procurement contracts for excessive profits and recontract where this is found. We just recently had these revelations about the enormous profits from the IT services supplied to GPs that have been made by this dreadful man who made the racist comments. So how can that kind of level of profit be justified? So scrutinizing these procurement contracts and trying to end a situation where private actors are getting such high profits, and end outsourcing of care services. I've been reading in the press recently all of these reports about how care services outsourced to private sector companies, which are not small scale or not for profit. They're big companies that are making huge amounts of profit out of supplying what's often very substandard care. So we have to think about ending that outsourcing. So I think those are the kind of reforms that I'd like to see in public spending. And reforms to combat short-termism and false economies in planning public spending. Short-termism doesn't allow for the longer-term benefits of public spending. You're not going to reap the full benefits of investment in a good early years care system in 5 years. 5 years is regarded as a huge long time in the planning of public spending. 3 years is, quite a long time. So we have to press for longer time horizons. And false economies. We have to avoid false economies. False economies happen when there is no allowance for the interaction of the spending of different departments. It is all planned in silos. So we've seen how cuts to social security increase poverty, and that leads to an increase in ill health. And that leads to more pressure on the NHS and on other services. And there's no way in the planning of public spending at the moment that those interactions are allowed for. And thirdly, this is something Women's Budget Group has called for consistently over the past few years, and Sue and Ozlem and others and Jerome have been instrumental in this. We've called for spending on education, health and care to be treated as investment in social infrastructure and not day-to-day consumption. In the way that the government accounts are done at the moment, if you build a hospital, that's investment, you can borrow for that. If you pay a nurse, that's consumption, and you can't borrow for that. Now, this doesn't make sense because a hospital has no value if there's no staff to run it. So I think we still need to be pressing on that, because actually at the moment there doesn't seem to be, although this has gained traction in the media, there was a Guardian editorial recommending this approach not long ago. It doesn't seem yet to have gained any traction with the Labour Party leadership or with Rachel Reeves. Now, these kinds of reforms will require changes to the economic modelling done by the Treasury and the Office of Budget Responsibility and the Bank of England, because these kind of models don't model these interactions between different kinds of what I'm always going to call public investment, and they have very short time horizons, and that's something I'll return to again. But that requires collaboration with other progressive organizations. It's not something that Women's Budget Group is going to be able to do alone. We have some coalition building there. So those are some ideas that if Rachel Reeves were here, I'd be telling her about, this is the kind of reforms to public spending that you really need to be thinking about. But of course, the second one is reform taxation and increased taxation. And the Women's Budget Group has consistently argued for increasing tax revenues through progressive measures. So one big measure to increase tax revenue in the early years of the austerity was to raise VAT. And raising VAT has a regressive impact. It means low-income people, it means they're going to be spending a higher proportion of their spending is going to go to the VAT. than higher income people. So that's a regressive tax. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have VAT, because it's also a tax that generates a lot of revenue and is easy to collect and can be spent on the kind of things we want to be spent. But it does mean that the whole system needs reforming to make the system as a whole more progressive. Currently, the UK tax to GDP ratio is high by recent UK standards, though not in comparison with high-income European countries. But a lot of this revenue, as I've just said, goes to boost the profits of private companies through outsourcing. Moreover, the tax system is not all that progressive. There is this heavy reliance on VAT. There's the failure to tax capital gains at the same rate as income from work. There's a lack of a wealth tax. There are tax breaks for fossil fuel companies, tax breaks for motorists due to the failure to raise petrol duty in line with inflation. The Labour leadership seems reluctant to announce that it will do more than close a few loopholes for the very rich. I mean, it's good to see they're going after the non-doms, but they'll have to do a lot more than that if we're to have the kind of investment in public services that we need. There are other below-the-radar tax measures that could raise more revenue. I think Richard Murphy has been doing quite a lot of work on this. And there's a workshop later this morning with Sue and Ignacia on wealth tax and revenue. And I'm sure there'll be more suggestions there that the Women's Budget Group will want to put forward to the Labour leadership and campaign for. So there are things that can be done to raise more tax revenue in progressive ways to avoid the kind of spending cuts that we've seen. The third point is increased government borrowing. This is the most complicated one. At the moment, we have a rule that at the moment, we have a rule that a fiscal rule adopted by the government that the ratio of borrowing to GDP should be falling at the end of a 5-year forecast period. And this is a rule that Rachel Reeves has said she is going to adopt and even strengthen, because we've had a whole history of these fiscal rules that the government then always changes when it finds the OBR figures show it's not actually going to comply with that fiscal rule. Well, Rachel Reeves has said, well, we don't want to have that. It makes things too uncertain. So she's going to build into this fiscal rule that the fiscal rule will not be changed unless the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, says there is an economic crisis that merits the changing of this rule. Now, that is going to be a big constraint on the kind of spending, the kind of public investment that the government can do if that rule is rigidly adhered to. There's a lot one can say about government borrowing, and I think I have no time, but the main thing is that the maxing the credit card image that's used to communicate was used by George Brown and is being used again by Keir Starmer to communicate about government borrowing is wrong. And we should do everything we can to explain how government borrowing is not like you and I borrowing on our credit card. If I borrow on my credit card to pay for a holiday or to buy some new clothes, it doesn't increase my income. In fact, it decreases my income because I have to pay the interest on the credit card as well as what I've spent. But if the government borrows and invests it, then this is going to increase the government's income in terms of increasing the revenue from taxes that the government has. So what really matters is not how much the government is borrowing, but what is it doing with the borrowing? Is it investing this borrowing in services and infrastructure, and including the social security system, that will have an impact on productivity, employment, economic growth, well-being, and in a way generate the returns that are required to service that debt. I don't think I have time now to say any more about why we should combat this idea of this rigid fiscal rule and what can be done instead, how that could be modified in some ways. The New Economics Foundation has been working on that. We should collaborate with them. So let me end there by saying there are ways that we can avoid austerity policies that impact most harshly on women and marginalized groups. But I'm not all that optimistic that the right policies are going to be adopted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. And actually, it's really interesting that you raised that point about alternatives to the fiscal rules, because we were having a planning meeting yesterday as a staff team talking about plans sort of to the election and beyond. And one of the things that we talked about was doing a project on kind of alternatives to fiscal rules and thinking about that. So I'm sure there's lots of people in this room we will be getting in touch with about that and saying, please come and talk to us and help us with that. So now I would like to hand over to Ozlem. And we asked Ozlem, how can we shift the narrative and policy-making processes to recognise and prioritise the long-term benefits of investing in health, education and care services, and how should this influence budgetary allocations? So, Ozlem, you've got some slides, haven't you?
I do,
Thank
yes,
you.
that's why I have moved. Thank you very much, Marianne. I'm really honored to be here to meet the early career researchers, the staff of Women's Budget Group, and some old colleagues, some people who have inspired my work, so thanks for the invitation. I'll be talking about the research we have been doing about feminist macroeconomic modeling and what it means for economic policy to answer this question, to change the narrative. And my departure in all of this is the big picture. The big picture is we have multiple crises that includes the care crisis in an aging society. It does include climate change in the context of intersecting inequalities in gender, class, and race. And this is happening in an era where the technological change has a new nature, and I think this time it's different in terms of the question where the new jobs will come from in the presence of the challenges posed by artificial intelligence and robotization. To answer all these multiple crises, we need a massive mobilization of state capacity, which means also fiscal capacity for a progressive government. This will be the locomotive of the joint policies or a policy package to tackle all these multiple challenges simultaneously. And at the core of that will be public investment in social infrastructure in the care economy. I'm using the word infrastructure investment here deliberately based on my learning from decades of feminist economics led by people like Diane Elson, the work of Women's Budget Group, who have coined the term social infrastructure investment for the currently labeled current spending in the care economy. It will also require a massive mobilization of public investment in the green economy. And we can't prioritize one or the other. We have to do both in the first term of a progressive government, starting from day zero. That requires a total new paradigm, which we have labeled as a needs-based approach to macroeconomic policy modeling and policy making that should address care deficits, ecological deficits, at the same time, the deep inequalities in our society. We can't have a competition between these needs. Also, these crises are interlinked. If you try to solve only one of them, you will make the other worse. That means we have to mobilize all the tools in our policy kit and coordinate them, all means of funding. It requires fiscal policy, talking to monetary policy, industrial policy, labor and social policies, all serving this purpose of mobilizing massive investment in the social and green infrastructure. That requires also moving beyond firefighting, short-run responses to emergencies towards medium-run planning. But an important part of changing the narrative will be to start by asking the correct questions. So what does a needs-based approach to policy for a green, caring, and just transition looks like? It requires asking a question like, how many care workers do we need in Britain, given the demographic challenges, needs of our society? Also, what would be the decent, adequate pay of a care worker to value the genuine social contribution of these key workers to our society, whom we have all clapped during the pandemic. And of course, this is all forgotten, and nurses have to still strike for an adequate pay rise, matching just even inflation. I said adequate, but this is wrong. It is really trying to preserve real pay losses or reverse them. It's not even bargaining for an adequate pay matching their contribution. We need to ask also questions like how much investment in the green economy do we need if we are to transition to a net carbon economy in the time frame that is advised by climate scientists. And the answers to both is we need a lot of public investment mobilization, and we can't postpone it. We can't prioritize one or the other. We need to do all of these. The list is longer, but this is some ideas to think about what a needs-based alternative paradigm of policymaking should start with. So, as I have already said, at the heart of that will be public investment in the purple care economy. A lot of us have purples on us. The term purple to chime with the green economy is being coined by İpek İlkaracan, who is currently the president of YAFI. I like using that, but I also still have to quote her because it hasn't arrived at the kind of household understanding as the green economy, green jobs, green investment have achieved. Of course, we need other infrastructure to support the purple economy in terms of hospitals, schools, buildings for the nurseries or care homes if needed. We need more social housing, and it has a gender dimension to it as well. And we need that new social housing to be green. Public purple investment isn't just about hiring new care workers in education, childcare, healthcare or social care. It's also paying them the adequate wages, as I have mentioned already. That's not too difficult, particularly if public sector is changing the way. That's going to go a long way in changing the wage norms. What is a valued work? Value what matters adequately, and social norms eventually change. Eventually, we need to also, of course, think about occupational career pathways of care workers, education and training requirements, but it has to become a career that everyone would like to be trained to get into, an attractive career with decent pay, decent working conditions, and dignified work, socially valued work. We need to think about labor market policies where we can also change the gendered occupational segregation patterns. Care economy hires predominantly women, or quite a lot of the positions there are held by women. That can change if the norms about the position of that sector changes, but also we need to see more women in the non-care economy. That requires thinking very clearly about training policies, but also hiring policies going beyond the existing occupational patterns. The new green jobs in renewable energy, in transport, in areas of organic agriculture, forestry, circular economy, should become jobs for women as well. And that requires thinking and planning. Mixing these public investment policies with labor market policies is very important. It is important, of course, for inequalities aspect of it. We need to increase the hourly wage rate of all workers while at the same time closing gender pay gaps. in a fashion what we call upward convergence. Labor market policies should definitely involve, as the Women's Budget Group is leading the way, a shorter working week, and that would require wage compensation, particularly for workers who are earning currently below a threshold. That would actually have a very equalizing effect, because if men work shorter hours, thanks to this legislation, they will be doing also more unpaid care work, in which women will be doing hopefully less of the unpaid care work, and they will pay more space to take up some of the paid work opportunities. So it's a convergence in terms of both unpaid hours of work for care and a convergence in terms of, hopefully between men and women, in terms of paid hours of work. And a little report that we had written for the Women's Budget Group actually does show that. Industrial policy talks a lot about green investment, but it has to start recognizing both that the purple care economy is infrastructure, it does increase productivity, and I'm going to come to that later, and it's also a green sector. So purple are green and green are complementary, or purple is the new green, if you like, because care jobs are green jobs. They are low in terms of their carbon intensity. They are very labor-intensive services jobs. That means with £1, you can generate more jobs. Therefore, you rely less on growth in GDP and thereby emissions to create jobs. It is an opportunity for redeployment away from the sectors that we want to degrow, such as the fossil fuel-based sectors, or Trident, the nuclear weapon sector. But of course, that will only work if we make care jobs attractive jobs with decent wages, decent working conditions, and decent career pathways. And I have already said that care jobs are crucial for increasing productivity in the rest of the economy. If we are serious about genuinely reducing working time, we need to increase productivity. There is a dual effect between the two, but we need more investment in education, in health, in childcare, in social care, to release, of course, the full productive potential of women, but also to create a productive labor force. In terms of changing the narrative, what I have been doing, and thanks to Women's Budget Group and other think tanks and social movements, these are giving some voice to the social movements, we are producing numbers. I think there is power in numbers and models. And I'm going to just tell you a few things about that in the final 2 minutes. But if you want to come and do that kind of number crunching, modeling with us at Greenwich, if you have a master's degree but not a PhD yet, we do have an ESRC-funded PhD scholarship with several universities in London, a doctoral training program called UBEL, and we are involved in the gender and sexuality interdisciplinary pathway. So if you know someone interested in a PhD, do come and talk to me later. There is a scholarship for that. So what we find in terms of the impact of public spending to create an economic case, an empirical case to support the business case for investment in the care economy, there are very strong effects on the demand side that then lends itself to very strong effects on employment. And this is what we call the multiplier effects. The public investment in the care economy doesn't stop there as a £1 spending. It has substantial multiple effects, the so-called multiplier effects, on both private investment and consumption of the households. And the pattern of consumption changes as well when the government hires more care workers or pays them better wages, since most of these are women, as I have mentioned before, and women spend differently given their heavier involvement in unpaid care in the family. They spend more of their income in things that will be conducive to improving health and education outcomes of the household. So not just the amount, but the composition of consumption of the households changes when there is more income in the hands of women who are hired by the public sector in the care economy. There is good evidence showing that, not just from our research, but economists like İpek İlkaracan and her colleagues. Of course, Women's Budget Group, Jerome Dehaene, Suhimil White, who are here, who have contributed to several reports for the ITUC or the ILO, and our recent work for the ITUC for many emerging economies, but also formerly for an ESRC project for Britain, is just supporting that. Similar multiplier effects are out there for public investment in the green economy or other infrastructure. But there are not just demand, but supply side effects too. And those supply side effects, that is, effects on productivity and labor supply, are stronger, particularly for the care economy. And of course, inequalities in terms of both income and wealth and gender gaps do interact, and they have effects on demand and supply side. So decreasing inequalities is good for both the demand and supply side of the economy. Obviously, different types of spending have very crucial gendered effects that we have to be mindful of. I was going to make one final empirical case. How can we fund this massive mobilization and urgent within the first 5 years of a government in both the care economy and the green economy, and shift towards a needs-based fiscal policy? Well, there is money, thanks to the good old multiplier, which is very high, particularly in the care economy case. Some of the public investment will be partly self-financing. But we can't just rely on that. We need to increase taxes on the top 1% in particular, and not just income, but also wealth. And I'm happy that we will be talking in the workshops more about that. And in terms of the urgency of the spending, the timing can't always match one-to-one. It will take time to legislate and enforce new taxation, so you need to borrow if you are to start spending from your day zero. That does require, going back to Diane's point, borrowing in a credible way, but our feminist understanding of that credibility is to redefine what is public investment and involve care economy spending as investment, not as current spending. Of course, there are other tools, National Investment Bank, and well, monetary policy has to accept that it's the small sister to accommodate the more powerful fiscal policy sister, and that requires talking about what central banks would do, and that means accommodative monetary policy with a high rate for a target for employment, a lower rate for inflation target, and a higher inflation target, in my opinion. But these are the topics of another workshop in the afternoon today. We have crunched the numbers for the UK, as I have said. If you do what we say, combine investment in the care and green economy with progressive taxation of income and wealth, and labor market policies for an upward convergence, closing gender gaps, we get much higher employment compared to today, thanks to a very strong output effect, a very strong productivity effect, and improved public finances. Public debt to GDP ratio actually falls, despite repeated and strong public spending in investment. Taxing of wealth is one of the key components in this improvement in public balances in our policy model. I'm going to skip what that means. I'll skip all the numbers for emerging economies. And I'll maybe say one more thing, last thing about, well, all this fits in, of course, in a policy way. We need to talk about unpaid care, recognize, reduce, and redistribute. References to Diane, which is something I couldn't finish without saying, but there's a lot more to discuss, hopefully later, and lots of work in the references. Thank you so much. Okay, I'll leave.
Thank you so much, Ozlem. It is very hard to compress the whole extent of the question we asked you, so that was very good. So now I'm finally, last but not least, I don't know if you're speaking here or up there, I'm going to pass on to Yuan, and we asked her to think about unpaid care, and in particular, how can we reshape economic policies to recognise and account for the economic value of care work, ensuring it's integrated into our understanding of economic development, and how can we reframe our understanding of growth into something that encompasses more than just GDP?
Great, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Yuan Yang, and I'm particularly impressed that 12 years ago when I was doing my master's at the LSE in economics, and I was first hearing about the work of the Women's Budget Group and came to a few budget group meetings, I think there was one member of staff, I think if at all, and part-time member of staff, and probably the total number of people in the room was about the same number of staff that there now exist in the Women's Budget Group. So there's been massive growth in the Women's Budget Group. Today I was asked to speak a little bit about my experience in setting up the campaign Rethinking Economics. And in contrast to Diane and Ozlem, who gave us more of the macroeconomic analysis of what our policy demands are and the reasons behind those demands, I'll talk a bit from the perspective of organizing and pushing for those demands and how we put the do in the think and do tank. So I mentioned there my coming into contact with the Women's Budget Group at the LSE, and I want to begin my story there because 12 years ago when I was doing my master's, I had just finished my undergraduate during the financial crisis, of course. I started studying economics and philosophy at Oxford in 2008, and it was a time when clearly the world around us was crumbling and being reformed into something very, very new. And yet, within the classroom, there was no discussion of the crises that was unfolding outside of our windows. And I found that when I came home in the holiday breaks after being at Oxford, my family friends who'd heard that I had gone into this prestigious university with a great economics department would ask me questions like, what's happening to interest rates? What's happening to the bailout of the banks? And none of these topics are in the undergraduate economics curriculum. How many, can you just raise your hand if you've been through an economics department, either worked in one or teach in one or have studied one? Great. Well, so you know what I'm talking about. In fact, in the kind of classical curriculum at undergraduate level, money in banking is assumed to be a kind of niche interest because, of course, the efficient markets hypothesis means that it doesn't affect the real economy, and how wrong economists were. And, of course, the Queen famously at the time visited the LSE and asked that question to the economics department there, which is, why did we not see it coming? From graduating in 2011, that was the first year, of course, of the coalition government bringing in the tripling of student fees, which again really politicized this issue, which on one level is really about values in society. You know, what is the role of education? What kind of education should we be funding for our young people? And how should we be providing it? But at the time, the whole national discourse was not about those. It was not about what I'd consider philosophical or political questions, but was purely about balancing the budget. And of course, the decision to have this discussion from the framework of balancing the budget, and a budget that, as Diane described, is geared towards capital spending on physical infrastructure rather than on anything to do with human infrastructure and services. That in itself, of course, is also a political and ethical decision that we have that discussion in the first place. And yet, the voices of economists and budget balancing was much more prioritized above the discussion of what even kind of society we're trying to build. So having seen that debate play out, I decided to continue pursuing graduate study in economics so that I could, at one point, be part of those voices changing the economics department. And once I arrived at the LSE, I found that there are so many visible ways of describing the detachment of the economics department from all of the departments around it. Of course, of course, there was also a feminist economics course that was being offered to master's students that was not being taught in the economics department, and in fact, its lectures clashed, I remember, with our compulsory econometrics lectures. So I would sometimes go to the start of my lectures and then run over to the feminist economics ones and kind of surreptitiously get my dose of feminist economics in my morning. There is, of course, economic history, philosophy of economics, economic sociology, demography, and so on, all these things being taught at the LSE, which has fabulous social science departments, but none of them are being kept within reach of the economics department. Now, you might ask, well, does that really matter? Because economists, people who like to do Hamiltonian equations and optimization and kind of fiddly mathematics can go into the economics departments. People who want to research these real-world topics of how real economies function can go into all these other departments. You know, there are, of course, lots of different options of academic careers in any university, including the LSE. So does it really matter that the economics department is like that? And I would say, yes, it fundamentally really does matter because of the issue of power in credentialization, because economics departments churn out graduates with master's degrees or with PhDs who then go into policymaking positions in the treasuries and central banks, in multilateral institutions like the IMF, which at the time that I was studying was just about to enforce an extremely severe conditional bailout in Southern Europe, in Greece, as a result of the Euro crisis. And because the credentializing of what is called economics and what is called not economics, i.e. all these things going on in other departments, matters for the mainstream discussion of what is important in the economy. And of course that matters to feminist economics, feminism being a movement that is concerned with the distribution and use of power. So I think the power of credentialization is really important. The way that Rethinking Economics was started off was simply me emailing a few other students on my course who I thought had similar concerns with me about the narrowness of our curriculum, emailing some of my undergraduate lecturers at Oxford who I thought might also be sympathetic. And from there kind of snowballing, they got in touch with a few more people who they thought, again, might have similar concerns. But very, very quickly, actually much more quickly than I'd imagined, we were already at a critical mass of several dozen students and academics in departments around the UK who were interested in getting together to discuss how we can reshape the curriculum. And so we launched with our first ever conference, which I organized while I was doing my dissertation in my master's. And it was one of those points when it was very, I think my approach often to organizing, as in to community or political organizing, is to try things out. And I think there has to be an experimentalism at the start of any kind of endeavor, because we didn't know whether what we were doing would really take hold in the department. So almost kind of on a slight whim, I thought, let's organize a conference. People will come, we'll discuss this topic, and we'll see if it has any traction. And it did have huge amounts of traction. There was a lot of media coverage, and I think it was that time just coming after the financial crisis where things were in disrepair, and there was a general sense that something needed to change. And there was a general sense outside the universities, which is very important, outside the economics departments, that there was something wrong with the practice of economics. But again, not enough people within the departments themselves to make a hold of change. And so another part of our strategy and our theory of change was a split of insider-outsider movements, that we needed students inside the departments and academics inside the departments who could speak to the departments, who could help us build the coalitions we needed with departmental heads and inside universities to press for change, and who also had, in the eyes of the media and the world at large, the credentializing ability to say, we are the students of these departments and we have a voice. We need to be able to be involved in our education. At the same time, of course, the insight and the inspiration and the research and the curricula don't come from within the departments, which are already extremely monocultural. They come from outside of the departments in groups like the Women's Budget Group and so on, and civil society at large. In terms of what happened, I think we made a lot of progress, particularly in departments like Ozlem's at the University of Greenwich, in small universities that are able to be more nimble about changing their curricula, and also could really see that there was a demand from students themselves, and that more attractive, more engaging curricula would attract more students. At the same time, in what I would call the citadel, the most establishment universities of the Oxfordshires and the LSEs, there was very, very slow progress. There was the addition of optional modules, for example, at Oxford and Cambridge, but there was nothing changed, I think, in the core of the curriculum. And instead, in those universities, what tended to happen was students would set up their own, what I would call encampments. So the citadel itself has very high walls and is very difficult to storm. But you can build your own encampments around the citadel where people are teaching their own courses or offering courses. For example, Kate Rayworth at the University of Oxford is offering a donut economics course, which anyone can sign on to. It's not credentialized. It doesn't give you credit in your economics undergraduate exams, but it's an option. It's part of an encampment that's built outside the citadel. And I think all of that has been amazing progress in the last 12 years, and Rethinking Economics is still continues to work and to network students together and is very much, if any of you are interested in getting involved, please do. But I also think that the citadel encampment metaphor kind of illuminates a fundamental issue at the core of what I would call our movement or our push to get feminist economics in decision-making positions. So where do we go next, and what do we do about this? Well, I think there are three things I would recommend. Firstly is that we need to change who is talking about economics, and that means getting more feminist perspectives into the media. I was part of a pilot program run by the New Economy Organizers Network, or NEON as it's called, who do spokespersons training. And that kind of 2-day, 3-day media training I found incredibly invaluable. And each year since it started, I've asked them, what have you found works and what have you found the most difficult? And year on year again, they say, we find it very difficult to get female economists in the media. So that's not even saying feminist economists, because of course many female economists are not yet feminist economists. But that just gives an illustration of the demographic issues here. And a couple of years ago, I also started up a small group that's called Feminist Economics in the Media, or FEM community, and just trying to support women to speak more in the media on economic policy issues. And I know that for those of you who might want to take dip a toe into that pool or to take a step forwards, NEON Spokespersons Network continues to recruit and is very much looking for women, particularly from ethnic minority backgrounds and underrepresented backgrounds, to speak. So I would very much recommend that to all of you. Journalists, as I know, having spent most of my career as one, often reach out for the closest, easiest commentator. And if you happen to be that person, it can be quite easy to speak from a very authentic perspective of your own, so long as you're given the microphone in the first place. So please don't worry about, do I need to sound like this? Do I need to look like that when speaking to the media? If you are given the microphone of trust, it is already yours, and you have the platform to speak. The second is, of course, getting more women in economics. And as a Royal Economic Society's stats still tell us that only 1 in 4 professional economists in academia in the UK are women. That's obviously an area that I'm really glad to see the Early Career Network and the level of support that there is in this room for that. And similarly to what I did when I was starting up Rethinking Economics, simply knowing who else is in the same boat as you, identifying your allies is so powerful. But finally, there's also women and feminists in decision-making power in politics. And I was told very strictly not to make this party political. But I would say that, of course, our current parliament is less than a fifth women. It's very likely that that number will go down in the next next intake slightly because of various Equality Act-related regulations we can get into later. But that number is not enough to really sustain the power in the room that we need to pass feminist policies. And that's not just because of essential, I don't have essential views about what men or women essentially do or think or want in power. It's simply that if you are part of a demographic that's more likely to be affected by certain policy changes, then of course your mind and your priorities are likely to be focused on those changes, and they're likely to be more pertinent to you. And I think that's partly why it's so important to have people from different backgrounds in Parliament. I'm standing for Parliament in my home seat of Early and Woodley, which is around the University of Reading. Please do come by if you're ever in the area, for the Labour Party. And one of the things that really got me involved in that was being part of a Labour Women's Network training. And of course, there are women's networks in all of the political parties that will give training. Again, it's not signing your name on the dotted line and being, if you turn up for a training, you can try it out. A lot of people do that just to see if a life in politics at whatever level, local or national level, might be for them. But I would really recommend either joining a political party or getting involved in the women's network of a political party, because it will open your horizons to the kinds of things that might be possible in terms of change-making that you might not have considered possible. And finally, I'll just finish with a point about the importance of feminist perspectives and the interplay between the kind of cycle between who is in power and who is empowered, which I think is also can be a vicious or a virtuous circle, which is that we know, of course, that with the influx of women into paid employment post-war in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that led to a lot of the discussion now that we have about wages, about unwaged work and waged work, given the entry of women into positions of waged work. And there's a kind of traditional narrative about the advance of time-saving technologies like washing machines, dishwashers, and so on in the latter half of the 20th century, and how that enabled women to enter the workforce. Silvia Federici, a feminist economist, kind of turns this question on its head by saying, well, is it the other way around, that once women have purchasing power and once their time is valued in monetary terms, actually then there is more demand for these time-saving technologies because it's the women who otherwise in the household would have been doing those jobs of washing the dishes, washing the laundry, and so on. And I quite like to think about this example because it shows you how interconnected it is, the question of who has power, who is counted, and who is then empowered in terms of a cycle of change. And that's why I would very much advocate for all of you to be involved in whatever level of movement you can be to advance our feminist economics agenda.
Thank you so much for that. That was a really, really brilliant and inspirational ending to this panel and left us, I think, with a sense of some things to go out and do, which is always a good point to end. Now, I'm very conscious of the time. I'm also conscious